Well, let me begin by saying it is such an honor to be in conversation with these three extraordinary scholars, intellectuals, and groundbreaking thinkers. And so what I wanted to do is begin by asking the question in some ways that the panel title poses, but also give them an opportunity to each talk about their work. We're talking and thinking about the histories and experiences of Black women in the Atlantic world. From the outset, at this frequently excruciating intersection of being held captive with both physical labor, manual labor, and reproductive labor, and finding themselves, creating themselves, and creating family in that context over the course of multiple generations. And we have this extraordinary geography in each of their respective works. But I want to start with you, Jessica, talking about what you identify as the sort of practices of finding and creating freedom in the context of enslavement and also emancipation, right? And across a series of locations and centrally in this city itself, right? In New Orleans, yeah.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking you, Imani, and Freddi, and Annette, and everybody here. Thinking about practices of freedom is something that is incredibly important to me. I think it's also really important to think about it in this time, in this moment. Especially here also, I think it's worth mentioning, and I want to kind of note like this current moment, like literally in this place, that right now thinking about how do we escape and how we navigate spaces of enclosure, of persecution, it's never been more important, and how Black women have done it and how they have used kinship to navigate that, I think is a pedagogy. It's a way of thinking, a way of learning how we might navigate this moment. Here, this is really important and poignant. Right now, Tulane is currently persecuting 7 students for protesting Tulane's decision to roll back DEI. Universities like Tulane must remember that the right to an education was fought for and won by African American students and women. Right. The student activists that are under attack from the Trump administration need to be protected, not persecuted by the universities, and programs that encourage diversity, equity, and inclusion should be protected just as fervently. We're seeing folks get sort of snatched off the street, getting snatched off the street, essentially. I know we've seen those videos circulate. And for me, thinking about how that relates to Black women in slavery, there's a direct tie. A direct tie. Jennifer Morgan, in her work, wrote about that first snatching of Africans in Mauritania, that first slave ship in 1441 that goes from Mauritania to Lisbon, has 235 Africans. And that first act of snatching is an act that is made possible not because people have might and not because people were not prepared to fight, but because they grabbed the children of a Black mother, and the mother went with them to protect her child. So I think when we're thinking about practices of freedom and kinship and the ways that kinship can be a mechanism for safety and care, and also how our kinships and our solidarities are also part of how, they are empire and slave owners were able to corral us. I think these things are very much aligned. The archive shows this. It shows this. And this archive here in Gulf Coast, Louisiana is so rich. I see some archivists in the room. I see the Amistad. I see Xavier. I see others, Historic New Orleans Collection. And so I think it's important to think about how are we seeing these strategies of resistance in these documents, in the tour records and the testimonies, and in the manumission documents, and in how folks are dancing and playing in places like Congo Square, something of Freddi's work as well. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Congo Square.
Yes,
Tell us.
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning.
And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this, because agency, the concept of agency, is at the heart of Congo Square.
Yeah.
There was no law that said that enslaved people were able to gather there. There was no law that gave them the privilege Yes, there was the Code Noir that said Sundays were work-free days, but for all inhabitants of the city. So by default, that included the enslaved people. But there was no law that said, you can go and dance. They took it upon themselves to do that. And any privilege that is given can be easily taken away. And that opportunity was taken away often.
Yeah.
So when people say, oh, they gathered every Sunday, they were out there every Sunday, that's not true. Yes. And this was the only place, that's not true. So we see the agency at the heart of the gatherings. And they persisted through all administrations, under the French rule, under Spanish rule, under the American rule. And we have the most eyewitness reports, the most information under the American rule. But agency, and then we can talk about the women. That's a whole nother concept.
Well,
Yes.
tell us something about the women.
Yes. Well, at the heart of it was the marketplace.
Yeah.
We hear a lot about the dancing, about the music, the musical instruments, and that's very important. And I believe there are reasons why that stands out most. But the market was an integral part of the gatherings. During the very first report that we have of gatherings on Sunday afternoons was on the King's Plantation in the 1720s. And LePage Duprat said there was always selling and buying. So the entrepreneurship, the agency was always there and the people who ruled the marketplace, of course, were the women. And that was by no accident, because if you've ever been to an African country or Caribbean country, who's ruling the marketplace? Who's dominating the marketplace, right? So the women transferred that experience, that talent, that ability to the Americas when they came here. And that was true not only at Congo Square, but throughout the city, the major markets downtown. That's one example.
And Annette, one of the many distinctions of your work is that you were able to, through careful archival analysis, tell truths that it took several generations for it to be borne out, that everybody would recognize about the genealogy of the Hemings family. And so can you talk about, well, I'd be interested to talking about both Elizabeth and Sally, but also the work of uncovering these women's histories and its significance for you.
Well, I started out writing about Sally Hemings because of her connection to Jefferson and the controversy over whether or not they had children together. And as you know, there were people who disputed that. And I wanted to start off talking about how that determination was born of prejudice and not listening to enslaved people and what they knew about slavery and what they knew about their lives. So from there, it occurred to me, when I wanted to write a bigger book about the family as a whole, that you could talk about the experiences of women through this family. Sally Hemings, her mother, Elizabeth Hemings, her sister, Mary Hemings, and others who had similar experiences, but different experiences within slavery. And also thinking about how resistance to slavery is typically seen by what men do,
Right.
the kind of things that men do, violence, open hostility, those kinds of things are important, but that's not, I mean, women have a different negotiation as you're talking about kinship and people going with their children. What does it mean to be a person who is enslaved and your labor is taken, but also reproductive life is taken, and that black women were made the engines of slavery by changing the rules about who could be a slave. Used to be, when they came here, the English settlers followed the English rule, you were what your father was. And with the growth of slavery, they switched it to the Roman rule, you are what your mother is. And that meant that only black women could be the vehicle of the institution of slavery. So how do you resist in that world? How do you fashion your life in a way that is tolerable in a situation where you are both a chattel used for your labor, but also you are the mechanism for the transmission of slavery. And I thought about Sally Hemings at first in a decision to come back to the United States, mainly not understanding that and thinking about it as sort of an amazing thing to do when she could have had an opportunity to be a free person, but then thinking about what she meant in the context of her family.
Yeah.
Her sisters, her brothers, her mother were at home. How do you decide what goes into that decision, whether you want to be free on your own or want to live with your family and try to make it together? And so that was an opportunity for me to explore her sisters and her mother's very different experiences in slavery along with hers, because people don't think of, because of the way people think about sex,
Right? Okay.
that the act is done to the woman. When people talk about getting over on somebody or doing something, they use the metaphor for that. And so there's a misogyny in that makes people think or say that there can be no resistance when someone has children with another person, but this individual, from the story that she tells her son, thought that she had, and she did, end slavery in her family line. And by the 1820s, her children are free, and their children are free. They get a head start, 40-year head start on the institution, on freedom, out of the institution of slavery. So it's a complicated question, and people go back and forth about, is this resistance, is it not resistance? But you're in a circumstance that's unimaginable. How do you maneuver through all of that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And one of the things that I think you have very different works, but what is shared is both a more expansive conception of what freedom is, right? Not just the legal category, but also about relation and about day-to-day practices, about kinship, about love. All of these things are, I think it's fair to say, become part of what you're talking about in terms of both seeking and creating freedom, right? Yeah. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. When I began trying to think about freedom, we have these examples like Jefferson and that complicated contradiction. And I think that, and we also have a very long and interesting and in some ways complex and messy understanding of how enslaved women are getting free. We have ways that we stigmatize the category of the free women of color. And I think Annette, you're exactly right, is that we don't really have, we've not had a really good language across the board for the kind of hard decisions that enslaved women, enslaved girls had to make, and for the really complicated ways that you can create safety and autonomy within spaces of enclosure. And so for me, defining freedom in that way, both as the act and practice of creating those safe spaces, and accepting and really trying to chart out how creating those safe spaces didn't always mean safety for others. And that's a hard truth. It didn't always mean, we think of on both sides of the Atlantic, free African property owners in Senegambia are in a practice of owning enslaved women, owning other African women. We see the same thing in the Americas. We see it all up and down the African coast. So safety and creating safety and autonomy does not necessarily always mean that it is safety autonomy for everybody. And I think that's a hard way to kind of think through it. But it also isn't something that we can sort of frown on. Like, we can't turn away from the ways that enslaved women and girls, enslaved people made decisions that maybe in today's sort of parlance of like, this is what's radical, this is what's progressive, we might not see that. I might look in the archive and say, oh no, that was a betrayal, that was this, that was that. And some of that is like liberal conceptions of freedom that are very binary, that are like, if you were enslaved and then you have a manumission document, you're free. And some of that is our inability to hold contradictions and complexities, but enslaved people could hold them.
Sure.
And they had ways of critiquing each other, of drawing each other into politics, of forgiving each other, because at the end of the day, the enclosure is so immense of bondage. The forces of slave owners were so heavy and hard against them that, you have to find some way to live. And again, just kind of refracting on this moment, I think we're in this moment where we're really going to have to challenge ourselves to think about complex and strategic and make hard decisions. And we're going to be confronted with our solidarities. And as much as it's been sort of an interesting history, all three of these histories, all of the histories of enslaved women, enslaved people, these are complex ones that have had their own controversies, As much as that is the case, I think it's going to be really interesting and maybe even heartbreaking in this moment to think about how do we practice freedom? How do we actually live the ideals and put them into practice? And how do we push through conflict and contradictions and the messiness? And how do we learn from those hard decisions? Like, do we want to repeat all of them? Or can we think about and see them and hold them as hard decisions that had to be made? And also, maybe there's ways that we can create the conditions where we don't have to make that decision again. And also, how do we forgive ourselves when we do have to make those hard decisions as well? So, not like clean definition of freedom, but yeah.
Is there an example of a woman you encountered in the archive who, it represents that complexity for you?
Sure. There are a few examples. There's many examples, but one woman that I do think of is, there's a girl named Charlotte, who I think of all the time. When I talk about her in the text, she's 18 years old, and she is caught in the bed of a sailor, a ship captain, and she's caught there, and what she says is, she's run away to be in his bed. And what she says is she is there because he is going to get her freedom and take her away, take her to Martinique. Now, of course, none of this plays out, and it's not clear that he ever intended to do that. She's just caught. It's also not clear what she's doing there, I must say, which I also love, the ambiguity there. I think of the audacity of Black girls who are 16, 17, 18. Like, think about what does it mean to be a teenager who is like, I am getting out. I'm done. I will do whatever I need to get out. Right? I think of her in that way. So I think of her, and her owner comes and claims her. It turns out her owner is her father, Pierre-Henri Derneville. And over the course of her life, she pops up in the French documents, and she pops up again in the Spanish documents. So over the course of her life, she does end up securing her freedom. First, she gets Derneville to draw up a will that says, I will free you when I die. And that is 4 years before he actually passes away. She does secure her freedom by essentially kind of suing him. Now she's in the Spanish regime where you can sue to secure your freedom. You can enter a practice of guardación. And then she goes on to, amass property. She begins to own her own slaves, her own enslaved people. And by the time she dies, she has property, she has children, she's also been able to get free and also have in freedom. And she, bequeaths, all of this to people in her community. And so her story always comes to me because I think of the audacity of this young girl and the world that she has to navigate, where she still, despite it all, secures her freedom and then goes on to continue to create spaces around herself and her people. And in this world, that means owning property. That means, for some people, owning enslaved people. And it means imagining a world in which there is a legacy that can be bequeathed. She's free now, so she can actually write a will that is her inheritance, right? So she's imagining legacies of freedom. She's imagining a future for her people being, like her kinfolk that she's chosen and she's claimed. And that, I think, is really important to think about. Like, what does freedom mean to a girl who is willing to do anything she needs to do to escape bondage of her father. So I think of her because of that. And then I also think of her because Derneville is part of a line of, Pierre is part of a line of Dernevilles that actually cross the Atlantic.
Yeah.
So the Dernevilles end up in Senegal, in Senegambia. And they also, on that side of the Atlantic, there is a line of free African women described as Métis, who are also descended from Derneville cousins, another male soldier who ends up over there. And as I was writing the book, I learned that the descendants of the Dernevilles, the free African women who are now 20th century, just African women in the world. One of their descendants founded the first museum of African women, which is at Gorée, it's on Gorée Island. And so these legacies are transnational, they're across time and space, they're intergenerational. And so I also think about that. What does it mean that, on these two sides of the Atlantic, that kind of kinship can emerge, even in the space of obviously it's violation, obviously it's lack of consent, obviously it's slavery and colonialism, twinned sides of the same coin. And yet these women are refusing, they're refusing to abide by it. So that's one of the ones that lives rent-free in my head. Yeah.
Freddi, I was going to ask you, was there, and I actually want to ask both Freddi and Annette this question about, is there an archival discovery that you can identify that sort of allowed things to bloom for you?
Well, I'll go first.
Okay.
I want to piggyback
Okay,
off
go
of
ahead.
complexities and freedom versus non-freedom. I gravitate toward the runaway slave ads, especially in New Orleans, because you can see so much information
In those ads,
descriptions,
yeah.
who was owned, who were the previous owners, where they worked. It's so much information. And one of them, when you were talking about complexities, was of a young woman who had run away. But the ad said her mother is free, and she's probably over there with her mother. Right?
right.
And they attend the balls. So they use the word balls, but I've heard people refer to the more formal balls as well as to the dances at Congo Square. So, that was one that came to my mind when you talked about the complexities. And another one that came to my mind was of a woman and her 3 children who had run away. And the ad said, well, she has a free husband. And her husband is over there, and she's probably with her free husband. Yes. And later on, as I continued to read ads, that were dated later, in fact, he was the culprit. She was found with her free husband. So complexities and the concept of freedom and the decisions that had to be made were just unspeakable. But we find them in runaway slave ads, so I invite people to really, really dig into those.
Well, a couple of things. Complexity, I start thinking of Mary Hemings, Sally Hemings' sister, who Jefferson goes to Paris and leases some of the enslaved people who remain at Monticello out. And Mary Hemings is leased to a man named Thomas Bell, who I think she may have been involved with to begin with. She may have been living with. But when he comes back, she asks Jefferson to sell her to Thomas Bell, and which he does, and their children that they have. And he never formally frees her, but when he dies, he leaves her the house that they live in, and he leaves after her to his children whom he acknowledges, and that house becomes a meeting place for members of the Hemings family through the 19th century. From Monticello and even after that, even after the war, it's still a place where people gather. And just thinking about her decision to leave Monticello to go live with this man who is her enslaver, but also is the father of her children, leaves her a property that she's able to use. And when there's the auction at Monticello, when Jefferson dies bankrupt, she's able to borrow against her house and purchase some of her relatives. So this decision had ramifications for not just her, but for all around. A discovery, when people wrote about Jefferson's father-in-law, who was also Sally Hemings' father, they always described him as a person who was trained as a lawyer in England. And it turns out he was not trained as a lawyer in England. He was actually a servant who was brought over to Virginia by a wealthy man, and he was given education, at William and Mary, and he became a lawyer and a slave trader. And I found that fascinating because what it meant was that Sally Hemings and her siblings, their father was not, he's not enslaved, but he was a servant.
Yeah.
He did the same stuff, kinds of things that they did. The difference, of course, being nobody could see their talent or their intelligence and give them an education and start them out in the world. They were doomed because of their race and because of their status to remain enslaved until Jefferson frees them. So this idea of a gap between the father and the children it looks very, very different in the way they would respond to him.
Can I shift gears a little bit and, because we're talking about these women who are making decisions in the conditions of constraint and enclosure and in captivity, and making decisions, reaching towards freedom, but also making decisions about kinship, making decisions about intimacy. I want to shift gears by asking for you all, as Black women historians, if you might reflect on your own decision-making and negotiating of the landscapes that we occupy.
I'm not going first.
Nobody wants to.
Because you've all, let me say it this way, that to become distinguished, well-recognized scholar, history in particular is a challenging field. And you've made decisions to tell stories that center the lives of Black people, Black women, right? In storied locations or in storied lives, right? And so,
I'll the history of slavery as a field at the university level in particular does not have a critical mass of Black scholars, does not have a critical mass of scholars who are necessarily interested in the political and social life of the enslaved. That actually was very much kind of a moment, and has continued to be different moments of scholarship, right? The one that really shaped me was the one that sort of propelled me into graduate school, which is, scholars like Ira Berlin, who was my advisor, Eric Foner, thinking about what is the kind of, in granularity, like what is the everyday life, but also of enslaved people, but also what are the politics that are being engaged in by Africans and people of African descent across time and space, right? So folks who know Ira's work know time and space is that crucial piece. And it's interesting now to think about, like, that actually was really radical, to imagine that slavery had a history, that it wasn't just, hey, here is the cotton plantation and the whip. But in fact, there are different levels and different flows and trends, right? And then the period that I think has so many amazing scholars that I absolutely feel like I look up to and trying to be in the tradition of Jennifer Morgan, Vincent Brown, Ed Baptist, Charlotte Fetz, folks who literally described themselves as doing new studies of slavery, were interested in the everyday politics of Black life, the everyday kinds of resistance, the politics of death, the mortuary politics, the reproductive resistance and labor. But those are hard-won historiographic and scholarly interventions, right? I think for the most part, as a field at the university level, history of slavery is very interested in the structure. They're very interested in what's on the page. They're very interested in the empiricism of slavery, which doesn't really get you down to everyday lives, and definitely to get you down to the lives of Black women. There have been struggles around, how do we read into documents? How do we read against the grain? How do we read along the bias grain, to think about Marisa Fuentes' work? And how do we push the documents so that we understand what the lives are like, not just what slave owners and other colonial officials, imperial officials are writing about them, and knowing that that's a practice. And that's a practice we can engage in and probably should engage in. Those have also been battles. And so for me, to even approach the lives of slave women and girls means having to really turn some of the practices of academic scholarship on its head, right? And really appreciate that Black women then and now are saying exactly what they mean when they're talking about the violence. They're saying exactly what they mean when they talk about protecting the people that they love. They're saying exactly what they mean in these testimonies and narratives of their lives and their manumission documents and what he did and why and who they want to give money to. We have to trust them. We have to trust enslaved people said what they meant. And that, I think, is not something that we are always willing or ready to do. And I think that's racism, I think that's sexism, I think it's misogyny, I think it's a desire sometimes on behalf of traditional methods of history to speak for those in the documents as opposed to sit with what is there. And I think there's a way that there's a condescension for Black people and how we navigate our world that can trickle down into how we read material and how we write material. And then you see that especially in Histories of Enslaved People. So doing this work has been interesting. Pushing against it has been interesting. Luckily, I have been, I really do believe that the work that folks like Jennifer Morgan, Marisa Fuentes, and others have charted out created the conditions for my work, my research, my scholarship, this book, the articles, the books, and the other scholarship that I will write, have written. I don't know that I could have done it without the battles that they fought. So, and that's just on the page. And there's being a Black woman in the academy, but we don't have to do all that right now.
Well, thanks, Jessica. I shared some of my thoughts. I owe my persistence to mentors. It's been difficult. Yeah. I go into the archives and I see certain people looking for, how many enslaved people their ancestors owned, and I'm wiping back tears and reading and wiping tears and reading, looking just to see if I can find mine. But I remember receiving comments from a professor, I won't name him, who said, "What is this? Yeah. You seem to feel sorry for the enslaved people. There's no need for this," And when I shared it with one of my mentors, Dr. Gwendolyn Mitchell Hall, she said, "See, this is why you have to do it. You have to be relentless." And with Kalamo Yasalam, the same thing, So if it were not for my mentors, I'm sure that, the tears and the difficulties and the conflicts would have probably stopped me in my track. But I persisted because this is the only story that I want to tell. My motto, so to speak, is to tell the untold and undertold stories of the African American experience. And I have come up against so many difficulties trying to get published, in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases. But I cannot compromise. It's just not in my spirit. You hear, tell what you know, write what you know, reach, and that is what I know and what I love. And so the mentors and the motto, my persistence has allowed me to stay here.
Well, I'm sort of an odd duck in this sense that I was a lawyer before I started writing. Before I went into the academy, I was at a law school and not in the history department, so I didn't come up through the graduate program. And I think there was something, looking back on it, there was something about being a law professor. Law professors think they know everything.
It's true.
Right?
As a former law professor, I concur.
I think we think we know everything. We think we can tackle any problem. The part of being a lawyer is becoming an expert in everything. When your clients come in with something and you got to figure it out, and whatever it is. And so I decided to write my first book instead of working on a law review article that I was supposed to be working on. I didn't tell anybody I was working on a book because I wanted to correct what I thought historians had done. And from the perspectives of a law professor, looking at evidence and saying, look, you guys are using burden of proof, evidence, all those kinds of things, and you don't really know what that means, and sort of saying if this were a trial, Jefferson would be found innocent, all that kind of talk. And I thought, all right, let's play this game. So for me, it really was the arrogance of law professors and a personality. I don't really think that much about what other people what other people think about things. I mean, it doesn't really concern me that much. And so a combination of personality and my training up to that point really has stood me in good stead. And I got lucky. I wrote my book in 1997, and I made these statements about Madison Hemmings is likely telling the truth, and the Jefferson family story about the Carr brothers is why Sally Hemings' children looked just like Jefferson, because they were the children of his nephew. That was crazy. It's not, all right, crazy's not a word. You can look like your relatives, but that just seemed far-fetched. And so the next year they did the DNA testing, and it corroborated what I said. So instead of, if that had come before, my book wouldn't have, wouldn't have been published. There wouldn't have been a reason to do it because of that. So it was a combination of law professor arrogance, personality, and luck that I got, a good result at the very, very beginning. So I don't really feel like I have struggled in the way that I know many people have struggled to get their stuff done. It's just that I picked a very high-profile subject, and something happened that doesn't happen, science weighing in on something that you say. So I consider myself to be lucky. I can't say, here, you do this, do this, do this, because it's not a normal trajectory at all.
Can I just say that that I just want to appreciate the audacity. I want to appreciate that, and also I really want to appreciate it in the context of, it's been years of the Hemmings having the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then all the other proponents of Jefferson, proponents of Jefferson having this other story. And anybody looking at the story is like the cartwheels that slave owners, enslavers, and their allies spin around to walk all the way around the truth. I just want to appreciate that how hard white supremacy works to keep us from the truth. That's really what I'm trying to say. And to the extent that, we then, have to use in some ways like devices of like DNA and science, like this, that's real knowledge. That in this instance and in other instances has worked in our favor, but that's how hard white supremacy is working. I just want to make sure we're appreciating that, wow.
Thank you, but the real thing, the reason behind the audacity, or if you were so kind to say, is that this very notion that the people who were oppressed in slavery had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that stuff that happens in every slave system happened to them.
That's right.
Instead of focusing on the credibility of their oppressors, you made the victims the people. I mean, proof beyond a reasonable doubt is the standard that's used for the government when the government is against an individual, because you want to balance out the power of the government versus an individual. And here, people were saying, well, Madison Hemmings is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, putting him in the position of a powerful government, and slave owners in the position of an innocent citizen being put upon by this enslaved person. It was, talk about audacity. That was just amazing to me, and I felt compelled to try to respond to that. So that's what that was about.
So we're in this moment, talk about the efforts of white supremacy.
Whenever you smile like that, I'm like, oh, it's going to be a hard question. Hang on.
Well, it's a hard moment.
Yes.
Because there's this sort of immediate threat to institutions, to books, to libraries, to archives, to historical records, to that, documented truths. And so I guess the next, what I want to ask you all to think about is, what is the responsibility of the historian now, from your perspective? Right.
Well, it's tough for me because I feel it as a scholar of the early American Republic and the revolution and slavery in the early American Republic, thinking about, we're almost at 250 years, and if this is what it's come to, this is over, pretty much
Right.
the notion of progress, is that over? So I feel it as a lawyer, but as a historian, I feel it as well. And the only thing I think you can do is to continue to do the work that we do and make sure that there's a record. I mean, the OAH is doing has an oral history project now. They're talking to many of the people who were fired in DC to try to, because they're erasing stuff, and to try to keep a story going, and we have to keep doing that.
I totally agree. That was going to be my answer. Just to keep researching, keep writing, and try and protect what we already have. I'm looking at Kathy out here with the Amistad Research Center.
Yes,
We have to protect the records that we have and keep using them to write.
I'm going to say absolutely the same thing. I think for historians, our guild is about truth, and for fascism, the goal is to tell you that what you see is not what you see. And so it has never been more important to research, to say and see, to research, see, and say what actually is happening. And that is always enough. That is always enough, because what is actually happening is hard and it's devastating. But I think we are part of and among, trusted guilds, the law, journalism, that have to move with real integrity in this moment and continue to lay out, no, there is a history to this moment. This has happened before. It is the same and different. Here is how it is the same and different. Here are my citations. Here who has reviewed and also, can corroborate what I'm saying, who has critiqued me, laying it out, over-communicate, over-produce, right?
Yes.
So that people can see and follow your footsteps. I love footnotes. So that people can follow your footnotes, whether they're like metaphorical or actual. People need to know that they can trust us with the truth. And they can disagree with us, but I just really think that there is a lot of work that is being put into the cartwheels. We're seeing the cartwheels again right now. Like, oh, don't look at me, don't look over here. Yeah. So I think that's really important. Also, for those of us who have any positions of power and access to resources, I think definitely making sure we're supporting our Black institutions who are doing the research, who are creating the archives. I think it's also important for us to create spaces where we are also able to collect, curate, collate. I direct a project called Keywords for Black Louisiana, keywordsforBlackLouisiana.org. I see some of our folks here. And the bag, with the bag. And so I think it's important that where you can create projects and support other scholars and researchers coming up who want to do this work and who want to know the methods of the Guild of History, that we do that.
And one other thing, we're citizens too. We're historians. We keep doing our work, but as citizens, we have things to do.
Yeah.
Council meetings,
That's right.
school boards, all those kinds of things. Historians,
Vote.
we can
That's
do
right.
that as well. Today.
That's right.
And on that note, we are done. Thank you all so much. That was fantastic.